They handed me the demotion letter on the same day I closed my fifth Fortune 500 client, watching me sign the McKinley Industries contract worth $12 million while sliding the envelope across his mahogany desk like it was just another Tuesday memo. The irony wasn't lost on me that Roger Blackwell, my boss of 3 years, chose that exact moment to destroy my career while I was actively saving his company from bankruptcy. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every handshake, every signed contract, every grateful phone call from those Fortune 500 executives had been building something far more powerful than quarterly revenue. They had been building my reputation, my network, and my way out. My name is Sarah Martinez, and until 6 weeks ago, I was the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Meridian Solutions, a mid-tier consulting firm in downtown Chicago that specialized in operational efficiency for large corporations. I'd been there for 4 years, ever since I finished my MBA and transitioned out of the Army, where I'd spent 8 years as a logistics coordinator managing supply chains across 3 continents. The military had taught me precision, strategic thinking, and how to build systems that worked under pressure. Corporate America, I discovered, desperately needed those skills, even if they didn't always recognize where they came from. When I first joined Meridian, the company was struggling. They had good ideas but couldn't execute them at scale. Their client retention rate was barely 60%, and most of their contracts were small fish, local businesses that needed basic consulting but couldn't pay premium rates. The big corporations, the ones with budgets that could transform a company overnight, went to the established firms with decades of reputation and armies of Ivy League graduates. Meridian was stuck in the middle, too expensive for small businesses but too inexperienced for enterprise clients. Roger Blackwell had hired me specifically to change that trajectory. He'd been impressed by my military background and my ability to speak both the language of operations and the language of results. During my interview, he'd leaned back in his chair and said, "Sarah, I need someone who can think like a general, but negotiate like a diplomat. These Fortune 500 companies, they're not just buying consulting services. They're buying confidence, reliability, and the assurance that whoever they're working with can handle complexity without falling apart." I'd nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. In the Army, I'd coordinated logistics for operations involving thousands of personnel, millions of dollars in equipment, and zero margin for error. If I could manage supply chains in hostile territories while keeping costs down and efficiency up, I could certainly help a corporation streamline their operations. In an air-conditioned conference room. For the first 2 years, I focused on building systems and processes. I redesigned how we approached client acquisition, moving away from cold calls and generic proposals toward targeted research and customized solutions. I studied each potential client's existing operations, identified specific inefficiencies, and crafted presentations that showed exactly how much money we could save them and exactly how long it would take to see results. I treated every pitch like a military briefing, precise, data-driven, and focused on outcomes. The results started small but consistent. We landed a few mid-size accounts, improved our retention rate to 85%, and began building a reputation for delivering what we promised. Roger was pleased but not impressed. He wanted the big contracts, the clients that would put Meridian on the map and justify the overhead he'd been carrying for years. He wanted Fortune 500 companies, and he made it clear that until I brought him those clients, I was just another competent employee in a company full of competent employees. So I adjusted my strategy. Instead of targeting companies randomly, I began focusing on corporations that were facing specific operational challenges that aligned perfectly with my military background. Supply chain disruptions, logistics inefficiencies, coordination problems between multiple departments or locations. I identified companies that were spending millions on problems I'd solved for thousands in military operations. The first breakthrough came 18 months ago with Titan Manufacturing, a Fortune 200 company that was hemorrhaging money due to coordination failures between their East Coast production facilities and their West Coast distribution centers. Their quarterly reports showed massive inefficiencies, delayed shipments, and frustrated clients. I spent 3 weeks analyzing their operations, comparing their logistics model to systems I'd used in the military, and developing a comprehensive restructuring plan that could save them $40 million annually. The presentation took place in their headquarters in Minneapolis, a gleaming tower with conference rooms that overlooked the Mississippi River. I walked into a room full of executives who looked skeptical about taking advice from a consulting firm they'd never heard of, represented by a woman whose military background seemed irrelevant to their corporate challenges. But I'd prepared for that skepticism. I didn't just present a proposal. I presented a case study that showed exactly how similar coordination problems had been solved in military operations, translated into corporate language with concrete financial projections. When I finished, the room was silent for nearly 30 seconds. Then the chief operating officer, a man named Harold Chen, who'd been taking notes throughout my presentation, leaned forward and said, "Ms. Martinez, in 20 years of corporate consulting, I've never seen anyone break down our logistics. Problems with this level of precision. When can you start?" The Titan contract was worth $8 million over 2 years. Roger was ecstatic, finally seeing the kind of client he'd dreamed of when he hired me. He authorized a company-wide celebration, gave me a bonus that was more than I'd made in my entire first year, and started talking about expansion plans that hinged on landing more Fortune 500 accounts. For the first time since I'd joined Meridian, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. But Titan was just the beginning. Word travels fast in the corporate world, especially when a relatively unknown consulting firm delivers results that exceed expectations. Within 6 months, I was fielding calls from executives at other Fortune 500 companies who'd heard about the Titan project and wanted to know if we could solve similar problems for them. Each new client brought unique challenges, but the fundamental approach remained the same. Analyze the problem with military precision, develop solutions based on proven operational principles, and deliver results that could be measured in both efficiency gains and cost savings. The second major contract came from Phoenix Global, a Fortune 150 logistics company that was struggling with coordination between their international offices. They were losing contracts because they couldn't guarantee consistent service standards across different continents, and their reputation was suffering as a result. I spent a month developing a standardization protocol based on military communication systems, creating frameworks that ensured every office operated with the same level of precision and reliability. The Phoenix contract was worth $10 million over 3 years, and it established Meridian as a serious player in the enterprise consulting space. Industry publications started mentioning our success stories. Roger began getting invited to conferences where he'd never been welcome before. Our revenue tripled in 18 months, and we moved to larger offices in a more prestigious building downtown. Contract 3 came from Hartwell Industries, a Fortune 300 manufacturing company that needed to completely overhaul their supply chain, management to comply with new environmental regulations while maintaining profitability. This was exactly the kind of complex, multivariable challenge that required both strategic thinking and operational expertise. I spent 2 months developing a comprehensive restructuring plan that not only ensured compliance but actually reduced their operational costs by 30%. The fourth contract, with Blackstone Enterprises, involved redesigning their entire project management structure to improve coordination between their domestic and international teams. This was a $12 million 4-year agreement that positioned Meridian as one of the premier consulting firms for large-scale operational efficiency projects. By the time I landed the 5th contract with McKinley Industries, Meridian had gone from a struggling mid-tier firm to a recognized leader in corporate consulting. Our revenue had increased by 400% in 3 years. We'd expanded our staff from 23 employees to 68. Roger had been featured in business magazines as an innovative leader who'd transformed his company by hiring unconventional talent and focusing on results over reputation. But success, I was about to learn, can be more dangerous than failure. When you're struggling, everyone wants you to succeed. When you're succeeding, some people start wondering if you deserve it, if you're getting too much credit, if you're becoming too valuable to control. And in corporate environments where ego and politics often matter more than results, being indispensable can quickly become being impossible to keep. The McKinley Industries contract was the culmination of everything I'd learned about corporate consulting. They were a Fortune 100 company facing a complete operational overhaul due to a merger with a European competitor. The project involved coordinating between teams on 3 continents, standardizing processes across different corporate cultures, and ensuring seamless integration while maintaining service quality for existing clients. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes challenge that would have been impossible for the old Meridian to even bid on, let alone win. The contract negotiation took 4 months and involved presentations to 3 different levels of McKinley's leadership. I flew to their headquarters in Detroit twice, participated in video conferences with their European executives, and spent countless hours developing proposals that addressed every possible concern about timeline, budget, and deliverables. When they finally agreed to terms, the contract was worth $15 million over 5 years, making it the largest deal in Meridian's history. Roger should have been celebrating. Instead, he was calculating. And what he calculated, though I didn't know it yet, was that I had become too successful for my own good. The discovery came not through dramatic confrontation or leaked documents, but through something far more mundane: a scheduling conflict with the coffee machine. It was Thursday morning, October 15th, and I'd arrived at the office early to prepare for a follow-up call with McKinley's integration team. The executive floor was empty, except for the cleaning crew finishing their rounds, and I'd planned to grab my usual coffee from the machine outside the conference room before settling into my office. But as I approached the hallway leading to the executive suite, I heard voices coming from Roger's corner office. The door was slightly ajar, unusual for him since he typically kept it closed during private conversations. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, except I recognized the second voice, Linda Kowalski, our head of human resources, who wasn't supposed to be in the office until 9:30, according to the schedule she'd shared yesterday. I paused, not intending to eavesdrop, but struck by the oddity of their early morning meeting. That's when I heard my name, spoken in a tone that made my stomach drop. "Sarah's become a problem," Roger was saying, his voice carrying that particular edge he used when discussing competitors or difficult clients. 5 Fortune 500 contracts in 3 years, and now every industry publication wants to interview her. Forbes called yesterday asking for a feature story about her military-to-corporate transition. Linda's response was measured, professional. From an HR perspective, that level of individual recognition can create internal tension. Other senior staff members have expressed concerns about the attention disparity. "It's more than that," Roger continued, and I could hear him moving around his office, probably pacing as he did when he was working through a complex problem. The McKinley contract negotiations made it clear that these clients aren't just buying Meridian services. They're buying Sarah specifically. 3 different executives asked me directly about her involvement in implementation. One of them said they wouldn't have signed if she wasn't going to be the lead consultant. My breath caught. I'd sensed this. During the McKinley meetings, the way they directed questions to me rather than Roger, the way they seemed more interested in my operational background than in Meridian's corporate history. But I'd assumed that was simply because I'd done the preparation work and understood the technical details better than anyone else in the room. "That's exactly the issue," Linda replied. "When individual employees become more valuable to clients than the company itself, it creates vulnerability. If Sarah ever decided to leave, she could potentially take those contracts with her. Or worse," Roger said, his voice dropping lower, "she could decide she doesn't need us at all. With her track record and client relationships, she could start Her own firm tomorrow, and probably take half our revenue with her. The coffee machine hummed quietly behind me, its morning brewing cycle creating just enough ambient noise to mask my presence in the hallway. I stood frozen, processing what I was hearing. They weren't discussing my performance or my future with the company. They were discussing me as a threat. "What are you thinking?" Linda asked. "I'm thinking we need to restructure her role before she realizes how much leverage she has," Roger said. "The McKinley contract is signed and implementation doesn't start for 6 weeks. That gives us time to redistribute her responsibilities, bring in some senior consultants who can handle the client-facing work, and move Sarah into more of a behind-the-scenes strategic role." "A demotion?" "Not officially. We'll call it a promotion to senior strategic advisor or something similar. Better title, same salary, but she'll be removed from direct client contact. We'll explain it as recognition of her strategic thinking abilities and our desire to have her focus on big-picture planning rather than day-to-day project management." Linda was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her HR mind working through the implications. What about the clients? If they specifically requested her involvement, we introduced them to the new project leads during the transition. Meetings. Professional, experienced consultants who can execute Sarah's strategies without becoming indispensable themselves. Once implementation begins and clients see that the work quality remains high, they'll forget about asking for her specifically. And if she pushes back? Roger's laugh was cold, calculating. Sarah's a good soldier, literally. She follows orders, respects hierarchy, and believes in institutional loyalty. We frame it as what's best for the company's growth, emphasize how her strategic insights will have broader impact, and she'll accept it because that's what team players do. The casual certainty in his voice, the way he spoke about manipulating my military background and sense of loyalty, hit harder than any direct insult could have. He wasn't just planning to sideline me. He was planning to use my own values against me to make me complicit in my own marginalization. "When do you want to implement this?" Linda asked. "Soon. I want the new structure in place before McKinley's implementation team arrives for the kickoff meetings. That way we can introduce them to their new contacts without having to explain why Sarah's no longer involved." "I'll need to document the restructuring carefully," Linda said. "We want to make sure this looks like a natural organizational evolution, not a targeted demotion. If Sarah ever challenges this decision, we need a paper trail that shows strategic thinking, not personal animosity." "Absolutely. And Linda? This conversation stays between us until we're ready to move forward. I don't want any rumors or speculation undermining the transition." I heard chairs moving, indicating the meeting was ending. Moving quickly but quietly, I retreated back toward the elevator bank, my mind racing through what I'd just learned. They weren't just planning to demote me. They were planning to erase me from the client relationships I'd spent 3 years building while making it impossible for me to object without appearing disloyal or ungrateful. The elevator arrived with a soft ding that seemed unnaturally loud in the early morning quiet. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the parking garage, needing time to think before I could face sitting in my office and pretending everything was normal. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Linda emerging from Roger's office, checking her phone with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just completed important business. Driving home through morning traffic, I replayed every word of their conversation, analyzing it with the same systematic approach I'd used for military intelligence briefings. The timeline was clear. They wanted the restructuring completed before McKinley's implementation began, which gave them roughly 6 weeks to execute their plan. The strategy was equally clear. Use my own professional values and military background to manipulate me into accepting a role that would effectively end my career in corporate consulting. But what struck me most was how completely they'd misread who I was. Roger thought my military background meant I would blindly follow orders and accept hierarchical decisions without question. He'd confused discipline with passivity, loyalty with naivety. What he didn't understand was that military training also taught strategic thinking, threat assessment, and the importance of gathering intelligence before engaging an enemy. And make no mistake, after what I'd heard this morning, I understood exactly what this was. This wasn't corporate restructuring or strategic planning. This was warfare, conducted in conference rooms instead of battlefields, using org charts instead of weapons. They'd declared hostilities by planning to destroy my career while using my own success as justification. In the Army, we had a saying, "The enemy gets a vote." It meant that no matter how perfect your plan looked on paper, you had to account for the possibility that your opponent might be smarter, better prepared, or more determined than you anticipated. Roger and Linda had spent their morning planning how to neutralize me as a threat, operating under the assumption that I would remain unaware of their intentions until it was too late to respond. They were wrong about that assumption, and they were about to discover that the enemy, indeed, gets a vote. But first, I needed to understand exactly how much damage they could do and how quickly they could do it. I needed to know who else was involved, what timeline they were working with, and most importantly, what leverage I had that they didn't know about. Because if there's one thing military training teaches you about warfare, it's that the side with better intelligence usually wins. And I was just getting started gathering intelligence. The full scope of the conspiracy revealed itself over the next 10 days through a combination of careful observation, strategic conversations, and what I can only describe as corporate forensics. What I initially thought was a simple power play between Roger and Linda turned out to be a much more elaborate scheme involving at least 4 other senior employees and months of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that predated my McKinley success by nearly half a year. The first piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Marcus Webb, our chief financial officer, who had always been cordial but distant during my time at Meridian. 3 days after overhearing Roger and Linda's conversation, Marcus approached me in the break room with what seemed like casual small talk about quarterly projections. But as we talked, he let slip a comment that made my blood run cold. "You know, Sarah, it's interesting how your client acquisition strategy has evolved since we brought in the external consultants for the organizational assessment last spring," he said, stirring his coffee with deliberate casualness. "I imagine their recommendations about talent management and succession planning have been helpful in structuring your approach to these Fortune 500 relationships." I kept my expression neutral while my mind raced. I knew nothing about any external consultants or organizational assessment. No one had mentioned succession planning in relation to my work, but Marcus was speaking as if these were established facts, as if I should know exactly what he was referencing. "Absolutely," I replied, matching his casual tone. "Those insights about sustainable client relationships have been invaluable." Marcus nodded, seemingly satisfied that we were on the same page about something I knew nothing about. Roger mentioned that the final implementation of their recommendations should align nicely with the McKinley timeline. Good strategic thinking to coordinate those transitions. After Marcus left, I sat in the break room for another 10 minutes, processing what I'd just learned. There had been an organizational assessment conducted last spring, months before my major client acquisitions began gaining industry attention. External consultants had provided recommendations about talent management and succession planning. And somehow, these recommendations were connected to a timeline that coincided with McKinley's contract implementation. This wasn't a recent decision triggered by my success. This was a long-term strategy that had been in development for months, possibly since the moment my first Fortune 500 contract with Titan Manufacturing started generating positive attention for Meridian. That afternoon, I began what I privately called Operation Transparency, a systematic investigation into the organizational changes that had been planned without my knowledge. I started with the most accessible source, email patterns and meeting schedules that I could observe without accessing confidential information. Using the calendar system that showed general availability for scheduling purposes, I began tracking meeting patterns between senior staff members over the past 6 months. What I discovered was a clear pattern of recurring private meetings between Roger, Linda, Marcus, and 3 other department heads: Jennifer Walsh from Business Development, David Chen from Operations, and surprisingly, Patricia Morrison, who had been hired 4 months ago as our new Director of Strategic Communications. These meetings occurred every other Tuesday at 4:30 p.m., always scheduled for 90 minutes, and always marked as Strategic Planning Confidential on Roger's calendar. I'd never been invited to these meetings, despite the fact that strategic planning was presumably related to the client relationships I was responsible for managing. More troubling, I noticed that these meetings had increased in frequency over the past 2 months, shifting from bi-weekly to weekly, and the most recent 3 had been scheduled for 2 hours each. The correlation with my client acquisition timeline was impossible to ignore. The second major revelation came through Jennifer Walsh, whose behavior toward me had changed dramatically over the past month, in ways I'd initially attributed to stress from increased business volume. Jennifer had been friendly and collaborative during my first 3 years at Meridian, often seeking my input on business development strategies and celebrating my client wins as victories for the entire team. But recently, she'd become distant and occasionally hostile, questioning my project timelines in team meetings and making subtle comments about the importance of institutional knowledge versus individual relationships when discussing client management strategies. What I'd interpreted as professional jealousy was actually something far more calculated. The breakthrough came when Jennifer accidentally included me on an email thread that was clearly meant to be internal to the strategic planning group. The subject line read, Q4 Transition Protocols, Updated Timeline, and the email chain revealed fragments of a much larger conversation about reassigning client responsibilities and managing external expectations during leadership transitions. One email from David Chen to the group stated, "The McKinley team has specifically requested confirmation that Sarah will be leading implementation. We need to address this expectation before the November kickoff meetings, or we risk contract complications." Jennifer's response was telling. Patricia's communication strategy should handle the client messaging. We frame Sarah's transition as a promotion to senior advisory role, emphasize that she'll still be involved in strategic oversight, and introduce the new project leads as specialists in implementation management. But it was Roger's reply that revealed the true scope of their planning. Agreed. The external assessment team's recommendations were clear about the risks of overdependence on individual employees for client relationships. We've had 6 months to prepare for this transition, and the McKinley contract gives us the perfect opportunity to implement their suggested restructuring. Reading this email thread felt like discovering a shadow organization operating within Meridian, making decisions about my career and the company's future without any input from the person most directly affected. They had commissioned an external assessment specifically to address what they perceived as my growing influence over client relationships. They had spent 6 months planning how to neutralize that influence, and they had scheduled the implementation of their plan to coincide with the period when I would be most vulnerable, after signing the McKinley contract, but before implementation began. The third piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected ally, Rachel Kim, a junior consultant who had worked closely with me on the Phoenix Global project and had recently been promoted to senior consultant. Rachel approached me during lunch on Friday with information that completed the picture of how extensively I'd been excluded from decisions about my own future. "Sarah, I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said, glancing around the restaurant to make sure we wouldn't be overheard. "But I think you should know that Patricia Morrison has been asking a lot of questions about your client relationships. Specific questions about contract terms, renewal timelines, and key contact information." Patricia Morrison, the Director of Strategic Communications who had been hired 4 months ago, supposedly to handle Meridian's growing public profile and media attention. I'd found it odd that we needed a dedicated communications director, given That our previous marketing efforts had been handled perfectly well by Jennifer's business development team. But now Patricia's role made more sense. She hadn't been hired to promote Meridian's success. She'd been hired to manage the transition away from my involvement in that success. What kind of questions? I asked Rachel. Everything. She wanted copies of all your client correspondence, details about which executives you work with directly, information about contract renewal processes, even copies of your presentation materials and project documentation. She said it was for developing case studies and marketing materials, but she was asking for things that seemed way too detailed for communications purposes. Rachel paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to say next. And yesterday, she asked me if I thought clients would be comfortable working with other consultants if you weren't available. She framed it as a hypothetical question about team flexibility, but it felt like she was testing whether your clients were loyal to you personally or to Meridian as a company. The implications hit me immediately. Patricia wasn't just gathering information about my client relationships. She was conducting research to determine how much damage my removal would cause to Meridian's revenue stream. She was building a case for why the company could afford to sideline me without losing major contracts. Did you tell her anything? I asked. Rachel shook her head. I told her that our clients appreciate consistency and expertise, and that any changes to project leadership would need to be handled very carefully. I didn't give her specific details, but Sarah, I got the impression she already knew most of what she was asking about. Like she was confirming information she'd gotten from somewhere else. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a legal pad, mapping out everything I'd learned about the conspiracy against me. The timeline was clear. External consultants had been brought in last spring to assess organizational vulnerabilities. Their recommendations had identified my growing client relationships as a risk factor for the company. A strategic planning group had been formed to address this risk, meeting regularly for months to develop implementation strategies. Personnel had been hired specifically to manage the transition away from my involvement in client relationships. And the entire plan was scheduled to be executed during the McKinley contract implementation period, when my removal would cause maximum disruption to my career prospects while minimal immediate damage to Meridian's revenue. But the most chilling realization was how thoroughly they had researched my psychological profile to develop their approach. They knew I valued loyalty, teamwork, and institutional success. They knew my military background had taught me to respect hierarchy and follow orders. They knew I would be reluctant to challenge decisions that were framed as being in the company's best interest. What they had planned wasn't just a demotion. It was psychological warfare designed to use my own values against me. They would present the restructuring as a promotion, appeal to my sense of duty to accept what was best for the team, and rely on my military discipline to prevent me from fighting back against orders from my superiors. They had spent months studying me like an opponent, identifying my weaknesses and developing strategies to exploit them. They had treated my success not as an asset to be celebrated, but as a threat to be neutralized. And they had done all of this while smiling at me in meetings, congratulating me on my achievements, and accepting my contributions to the company's growth. But what they hadn't counted on was that military training teaches you to recognize when you're under attack, even when that attack comes from people you trust. And once you recognize you're in a combat situation, everything changes. The rules of engagement shift from cooperation to survival, from loyalty to self-preservation. They had declared war on my career while expecting me to remain ignorant of the battlefield. That was their first strategic mistake. Their second mistake was assuming that my military background made me predictable and controllable. They were about to discover how wrong they were on both counts. The validation came from an unexpected source at precisely the moment when I needed it most. 2 weeks after discovering the full extent of the conspiracy against me, while I was still processing the betrayal and formulating my response strategy, my phone rang with a call that would fundamentally shift the balance of power in ways none of my colleagues could have anticipated. Ms. Martinez? This is Elizabeth Crawford from McKinley Industries. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. Elizabeth Crawford was McKinley's chief operating officer, the executive who had ultimately signed off on our $15 million contract after months of negotiations. She was known throughout the industry as someone who didn't make casual phone calls or engage in unnecessary small talk. When Elizabeth Crawford called you directly, it meant something important was happening. Not at all, Ms. Crawford. How can I help you? I wanted to reach out personally because we've been discussing the implementation timeline with my team, and we have some specific requests regarding project leadership structure. I know this might be unusual, but we'd like to formalize some arrangements that were discussed during our negotiations but not explicitly outlined in the contract documentation. My pulse quickened. During the contract negotiations, McKinley's executives had repeatedly emphasized their preference for working directly with me, but these preferences had been expressed verbally rather than written into the formal agreement. At the time, I'd assumed this was standard practice. Clients often requested specific consultants without making it a contractual requirement. What kind of arrangements are you thinking about? I asked. We want to add a project leadership clause that designates you as the primary consultant for all phases of implementation. My team has been very clear that our comfort level with this project is directly tied to your involvement. We've seen too many consulting projects fail because key personnel were reassigned or removed during implementation. Elizabeth paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. I'm going to be direct with you, Sarah. We're not just buying Meridian's consulting services. We're buying your expertise, your operational background, and your track record. With similar projects, if that's not what we're getting, we need to know now so we can adjust our timeline and budget accordingly. The implications of what she was saying hit me immediately. McKinley wasn't just expressing a preference for my involvement. They were making my leadership a condition of their continued participation in the project. This was exactly the scenario that Roger and Linda had feared. A client whose loyalty was to me personally, rather than to Meridian as an institution. I appreciate that confidence, Ms. Crawford. Can you help me understand what specific concerns your team has about project leadership continuity? Frankly, we've had bad experiences with consulting firms that use their best people to win contracts and then hand off implementation to junior staff or different consultants entirely. We've done our due diligence on you specifically. Your military background, your track record with Fortune 500 operational projects, your approach to complex logistics coordination. That's what we're paying for. Elizabeth's tone became more businesslike, indicating that this wasn't a casual conversation, but a formal clarification of contractual expectations. We'd like to schedule a meeting with you and Roger Blackwell to discuss adding language to the contract that ensures your continued involvement throughout all implementation phases. Our legal team can draft the amendment language, but we want to make sure everyone's on the same page before we proceed. After hanging up, I sat in my office staring at the phone, processing what had just happened. McKinley Industries, a Fortune 100 company with unlimited consulting options, had just called to demand contractual assurance of my personal involvement in their project. They weren't just satisfied with my work. They considered my leadership essential to their success. This call represented exactly the validation I needed, but it also created a strategic opportunity that I'm certain Roger and Linda hadn't anticipated. If McKinley insisted on contractual language guaranteeing my involvement, any attempt to remove me from the project would constitute a breach of contract that could cost Meridian $15 million and destroy their reputation in the industry. But the validation didn't stop with McKinley. Within 48 hours of Elizabeth Crawford's call, I received similar outreach from executives at 3 of my other Fortune 500 clients. The pattern was unmistakable. Word was spreading through corporate networks that my previous clients were not just satisfied with results, but specifically attributing their success to my individual contributions. Harold Chen from Titan Manufacturing, called on Thursday afternoon with news that would have been career-defining under normal circumstances. Sarah, I wanted to give you a heads up about something that might interest you. We've been so impressed with the results from your logistics restructuring that our board has approved expansion of the project to our European operations. We're talking about a $25 million 3-year engagement. Harold's voice carried the enthusiasm of an executive who had just received board approval for a project he was excited about. But here's the thing. The board was very specific that this expansion is contingent on your continued involvement. They've seen the efficiency improvements, the cost savings, the operational stability improvements. They don't want to risk that success by working with anyone else. The Titan expansion project would be the largest single contract in Meridian's history, nearly double the size of the McKinley deal. But more importantly, it represented tangible proof that my client relationships were generating ongoing revenue opportunities that extended far beyond initial contracts. I'm honored by that confidence, Harold. What timeline is the board considering for implementation? We'd like to begin preliminary planning in January, with full implementation starting in March. Obviously, we'll need to coordinate with Meridian's leadership about your availability, but from our perspective, this project doesn't move forward without you leading it. The third validation came from an entirely unexpected direction. A headhunter representing a Fortune 50 company that I'd never worked with directly. Rebecca Foster from Executive Search Solutions called on Friday morning with an opportunity that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Ms. Martinez, I represent a client who has been following your work in corporate operational consulting, particularly your success with large-scale logistics and coordination projects. They're interested in discussing a position that would be a significant step up from your current role. Rebecca's tone was professional but urgent, suggesting that her client was serious about moving quickly. Without going into specifics over the phone, I can tell you that we're talking about a senior vice president position with full autonomy over operational consulting strategy, a team of 20-plus consultants, and a compensation package that would likely double your current earnings. The position she was describing sounded like exactly the kind of role that Roger claimed I wasn't ready for. The senior leadership position that supposedly required more experience and different skills than I currently possessed. Yet here was a Fortune 50 company actively recruiting me for precisely that level of responsibility. What's the timeline for this opportunity? I asked. They'd like to schedule initial conversations within the next 2 weeks. The position would ideally be filled by the end of the year, which I know is aggressive, but they've been impressed by your track record and they're looking for someone who can hit the ground running. As I hung up from that call, I realized that the market validation I was receiving created a perfect storm of leverage that my colleagues at Meridian couldn't possibly have anticipated. Not only were my existing clients demanding my continued involvement in their projects, but new opportunities were emerging that demonstrated my value in the broader corporate consulting market. Roger and Linda had planned their strategy around the assumption that I was dependent on Meridian for my career success, that removing me from client-facing roles would effectively end my consulting career and force me to accept whatever position they offered. They had underestimated not just my relationships with existing clients, but my reputation in the industry and the demand for my specific skill set. But perhaps most importantly, they had failed to understand that military training teaches you to build strategic reserves and maintain multiple contingency plans. While they had been planning how to diminish my role within Meridian, I had been building relationships and establishing credibility that extended far beyond any single company. The phone calls from McKinley, Titan, and the headhunter weren't just professional validation. They were strategic intelligence that fundamentally changed the power dynamics of my situation. Roger and Linda thought they held all the cards because they controlled my position within Meridian. What they didn't realize was that my position within Meridian was no longer the most valuable card in the deck. Over the weekend, I prepared a comprehensive analysis of the strategic situation, approaching it with the same systematic methodology I'd used for military intelligence assessments. The facts were clear. My clients valued my individual contributions more than they valued Meridian's institutional reputation. My market value had increased dramatically based on demonstrated results with Fortune 500 companies. And opportunities existed outside Meridian that would not only preserve my career, but potentially accelerate it beyond anything I could achieve within my current company. But perhaps most importantly, I now had leverage that my colleagues didn't know about and couldn't control. McKinley's demand for contractual assurance of my involvement meant that any attempt to remove me from their project would trigger immediate legal and financial consequences for Meridian. Titan's expansion project was explicitly contingent on my leadership, meaning that sidelining me would cost Meridian $25 million in lost revenue. And the external opportunity represented an escape route that would allow me to leave Meridian on my own terms rather than accepting whatever diminished role they had planned for me. The strategic picture was becoming clear. Roger and Linda had declared war on my career, but they had done so from a position of weakness rather than strength. They needed me more than I needed them, but they hadn't realized it yet because they were focused on internal politics rather than external market realities. That was about to change. And when it did, they would discover that the balance of power in this conflict was not what they had assumed. The isolation began subtly, like a tide receding so gradually that you don't notice the water disappearing until you're standing on dry sand wondering when the ocean moved away. It started with email threads that somehow forgot to include me, meetings that were rescheduled without notification, and casual conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached. Within 2 weeks of the McKinley validation calls, I found myself systematically excluded from decisions that directly affected the projects I had built from the ground up. The first concrete sign came through Jennifer Walsh, whose behavior towards me had evolved from professional coolness to outright hostility disguised as corporate politeness. During our weekly business development meeting, she announced a new protocol for client communications that seemed specifically designed to limit my direct contact with Fortune 500 executives. We're implementing a more structured approach to client relationship management, Jennifer explained to the assembled team, her eyes carefully avoiding mine. All client communications regarding strategic planning or contract modifications will now be routed through business development for coordination and oversight. This ensures consistent messaging and prevents any confusion about who has authority to make commitments on behalf of Meridian. The policy was presented as a company-wide improvement, but everyone in the room understood that it was specifically targeted at my client relationships. No other consultant at Meridian had the level of direct client access that would be affected by this new protocol. Jennifer was essentially installing herself as a gatekeeper between me and the executives who had specifically requested to work with me. What about ongoing projects where clients have established communication patterns with their lead consultants? I asked, keeping my tone professional despite the obvious implications. Those relationships will be transitioned gradually, Jennifer replied smoothly. We want to maintain continuity while building broader institutional relationships that aren't dependent on individual consultants. David Chen, who had been silent throughout most of the meeting, added what seemed like a supportive comment but felt more like a warning. This approach has been very successful at other consulting firms. Clients initially prefer working with individual consultants, but they adapt quickly to institutional processes when they see the benefits of coordinated team support. The message was clear. My direct client relationships were being systematically dismantled under the guise of improved company procedures. Within a week, I discovered that Jennifer had scheduled introductory calls between herself and key contacts at McKinley, Titan, and Phoenix Global, ostensibly to coordinate implementation support, but actually to insert herself into relationships that had taken me years to build. The second phase of isolation involved my access to internal information about projects that I was supposedly still leading. Patricia Morrison, the Strategic Communications Director, began scheduling what she called project alignment meetings with my team members, discussing strategy and timelines without including me in the conversations. When I asked Rachel Kim about a meeting she'd attended with Patricia regarding the McKinley implementation timeline, her discomfort was obvious. She said she needed to understand project details for communications planning, but she was asking about things like potential roadblocks, alternative strategies, and contingency plans. It felt more like she was preparing to take over project management than just handling communications. More troubling, I discovered that Patricia had been requesting copies of all my project documentation, client correspondence, and strategic planning materials. When I questioned this through official channels, I was told that it was part of a new institutional knowledge management initiative designed to ensure that important information wasn't siloed with individual employees. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were using my own success as justification for limiting my access to the projects that had created that success. Because I had been so effective at building client relationships and delivering results, company leadership now considered it risky to allow me continued control over those relationships and results. The third element of my isolation was perhaps the most psychologically damaging: the systematic exclusion from strategic planning discussions about the future of the consulting practice. Marcus Webb, who had previously sought my input on financial projections and growth strategies, suddenly stopped including me in budget planning conversations. When I asked about quarterly forecasts for my client accounts, he told me that financial planning was being centralized to ensure consistent methodology across all projects. But the most devastating exclusion came when I accidentally discovered that senior staff meetings had been reorganized specifically to prevent my participation. For 3 years, I had attended weekly leadership meetings where department heads discussed ongoing projects, upcoming opportunities, and strategic challenges. These meetings had been scheduled for Tuesday mornings, and my attendance had never been questioned. In late November, I arrived at the conference room for our usual Tuesday meeting only to find it empty. Confused, I checked with Roger's assistant, who seemed genuinely surprised by my question. "Oh, the leadership meetings were moved to Thursday afternoons about 3 weeks ago," she said. "I thought you knew." But I hadn't been notified of the schedule change, and when I reviewed my calendar, I found no record of Thursday afternoon meetings. It took me another week to discover that the meetings were still happening on Tuesday mornings, but the attendee list had been modified to exclude me. The Thursday afternoon meetings were a different set of discussions focused on operational details rather than strategic planning. They had literally created a shadow meeting structure to ensure that I remained unaware of high-level decisions about the company's future while maintaining the appearance that nothing had changed. When I confronted Roger about this exclusion, his response was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. "Sarah, we've been trying to be more mindful of your time management," he said with practiced sincerity. "Your client responsibilities have increased so significantly that we didn't want to burden you with administrative discussions that don't directly relate to your project work. We thought you'd appreciate the opportunity to focus on what you do best rather than sitting through budget meetings and policy discussions." The explanation was superficially reasonable, even considerate, but it represented a fundamental redefinition of my role within the company. I was being repositioned from a strategic leader who contributed to company planning to an operational employee who executed decisions made by others. My growing success with clients was being used as justification for excluding me from the strategic conversations that would determine how that success was leveraged for the company's future. The fourth and most personally painful aspect of my isolation involved the erosion of relationships with colleagues who had previously been allies and friends. Rachel Kim, who had been my closest collaborator on multiple projects, began avoiding one-on-one conversations and seemed uncomfortable whenever we interacted in group settings. When I asked her directly if something was wrong, her response revealed the extent to which my colleagues were being pressured to distance themselves from me. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this, but I've been told that my promotion review might be affected by my association with consultants who are seen as prioritizing individual recognition over team collaboration." she said during a private conversation in the parking garage. "I was specifically asked about my working relationship with you, and whether I thought your approach to client management was sustainable for the company long term." Rachel's admission hit me harder than any of the official policy changes or meeting exclusions. They weren't just isolating me from clients and strategic planning. They were actively pressuring my colleagues to view association with me as a career liability. The people I had mentored, collaborated with, and celebrated alongside were being forced to choose between their loyalty to me and their own professional security. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them that working with you had been one of the most valuable learning experiences of my career, and that any consultant would be lucky to have your expertise and leadership," Rachel replied. "But Sarah, I also need this job. I have student loans, a mortgage, and a family to support. I can't afford to be seen as part of whatever political situation is developing around your role here." Similar conversations with other team members revealed that my isolation wasn't just systematic. It was being enforced through implicit threats to their own career advancement. David Chen had questioned several consultants about their perspectives on team-focused versus individual-focused project management styles. Linda Kowalski had scheduled one-on-one meetings with junior staff members to discuss professional development and mentorship relationships. Patricia Morrison had been asking about consultants' long-term career goals and whether they saw their future success as tied to specific senior colleagues or to institutional growth. The message was consistent. Association with me was becoming a professional risk, and anyone who wanted to advance within Meridian needed to demonstrate their primary loyalty to the company rather than to individual mentors or colleagues. My success, which should have elevated everyone around me, was being weaponized to turn my own team members against me. By early December, the isolation was complete. I was still officially the lead consultant on multiple Fortune 500 projects, but I had been cut off from strategic planning, client relationship management, team leadership, and institutional decision-making. I was being systematically erased from the organizational structure while maintaining the appearance of continued employment and responsibility. But perhaps most insidiously, the isolation was being implemented in ways that made it difficult for me to object without appearing paranoid, ungrateful, or politically motivated. Every exclusion was explained as being in my best interest or in the company's best interest. Every policy change was presented as an improvement to efficiency or communication. Every relationship that was damaged was framed as a natural evolution of professional dynamics rather than the result of deliberate manipulation. They were conducting a masterful campaign of professional assassination, destroying my position within the company while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. And they were doing it with the expectation that my military background and professional discipline would prevent me from fighting back against what they presented as legitimate organizational decisions. What they hadn't anticipated was that military training also teaches you to recognize siege warfare when you're experiencing it. And once you understand that you're under siege, you have two choices: surrender or break the siege on your own terms. I was done being isolated. It was time to break the siege. The preparation began in the most mundane place possible, a storage unit 20 minutes from my apartment, rented under my maiden name and paid for with cash. Military logistics training had taught me that successful operations require secure staging areas where you can build capabilities without enemy surveillance. In corporate warfare, that meant creating systems and resources that existed completely outside my employer's knowledge or control. The first asset I secured was information. Over the course of 3 years at Meridian, I had accumulated extensive documentation of my client relationships, project methodologies, and strategic frameworks. While the company owned the intellectual property I had developed during my employment, they didn't own the knowledge, experience, and relationships that I had built. More importantly, they didn't own the personal connections and trust that my clients had developed with me as an individual. I began systematically documenting every client interaction, every successful strategy implementation, and every operational improvement that could be attributed to my specific methodologies rather than Meridian's general consulting approach. This wasn't about stealing company secrets. It was about establishing a clear record of which innovations and results were directly tied to my military background and strategic thinking versus generic consulting practices that any firm could provide. The documentation process revealed something that even I hadn't fully appreciated. My approach to corporate consulting was fundamentally different from traditional business school methodologies. Where most consultants focused on incremental improvements and best practices, I applied military operational principles that emphasized rapid deployment, systematic risk assessment, and adaptive logistics management. My clients weren't just buying consulting services. They were buying access to strategic frameworks that had been tested in high-stakes military operations and translated into corporate environments. The second phase of preparation involved securing my financial independence. The external opportunity that Rebecca Foster had presented was progressing faster than I had anticipated. The Fortune 50 company she represented, Apex Industries, was actively courting me for a senior vice president position that would more than double my current compensation, while providing equity participation in their rapidly growing consulting division. But more importantly, the Apex opportunity represented complete autonomy to build my own team and implement my own strategic vision without political interference or institutional limitations. During my second interview with their executive team, CEO Jonathan Martinez made it clear that they were specifically recruiting me to challenge their existing operational paradigms with military-derived strategic thinking. "Sarah, we've been following your work at Meridian, and frankly, we think you're operating at about 30% of your potential within their organizational structure," Jonathan said during our video conference. "We want to give you the resources and authority to show us what 100% looks like." The Apex position would officially begin in January, giving me a clean transition timeline that aligned perfectly with the completion of my current project commitments at Meridian. But the real strategic value of the opportunity was that it provided me with unassailable leverage in any confrontation with Roger and Linda. They could threaten my position at Meridian, but they couldn't threaten my career prospects or financial security. The third element of my preparation was the most complex, ensuring that my departure from Meridian would not damage the client relationships I had worked years to build. The McKinley contract amendment that Elizabeth Crawford had requested was proceeding through legal review, but I realized that contractual protection was only one component of a comprehensive client transition strategy. I began having carefully structured conversations with key executives at each of my Fortune 500 clients, discussions that appeared to be routine project updates, but were actually strategic intelligence gathering about their long-term consulting needs and their perspectives on institutional versus individual consultant relationships. Harold Chen from Titan Manufacturing provided the most revealing insight during a call that was supposedly about the European expansion timeline. "You know, Sarah, our board has been discussing the importance of consultant continuity for long-term operational projects. We've had too many experiences where consulting firms assign their best people to win contracts and then rotate in junior staff for implementation. That's exactly what we're trying to avoid with this expansion." When I asked Harold how Titan typically handled situations where key consultants changed firms or roles, his response was unequivocal. "We follow the expertise, not the company letterhead. If a consultant has proven their value and established trust with our operations team, we're much more interested in maintaining that relationship than in maintaining loyalty to a particular firm." Similar conversations with executives at McKinley, Phoenix Global, and my other major clients revealed a consistent pattern. These companies viewed their consulting relationships as partnerships with specific individuals rather than institutional contracts with faceless corporations. They had chosen to work with Meridian because of my track record and expertise, not because of the company's reputation or resources. This intelligence fundamentally changed my strategic calculus. Rather than trying to preserve my position within Meridian, I could focus on preserving my relationships with clients who valued my individual contributions. If those clients were willing to follow my expertise to a new firm, then my departure from Meridian wouldn't represent a career setback. It would represent an opportunity to build something better without political interference. The fourth and final component of my preparation was psychological. Accepting that the organization I had served loyally for 4 years no longer deserved that loyalty. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of my strategic planning, because it required abandoning the institutional attachment that had been central to my military and corporate identity. But Roger and Linda had made the choice for me. By systematically isolating me, undermining my client relationships, and manipulating my colleagues against me, they had violated the fundamental trust that makes organizational loyalty possible. They had treated my success as a threat rather than an asset. And they had responded to that perceived threat by attempting to destroy the very relationships and capabilities that had generated success. Military ethics taught clear principles about when institutional loyalty becomes counterproductive, when the institution betrays its stated values, when leadership prioritizes politics over mission effectiveness, and when continuing to serve the institution requires compromising your own integrity. All 3 conditions were clearly present in my situation at Meridian. The preparation phase concluded with a simple realization. I didn't need to fight to preserve my position within a company that no longer valued my contributions. Instead, I could leverage my proven track record, client relationships, and external opportunities to build something better. The question wasn't whether I could survive their betrayal. The question was whether they could survive my departure. By mid-December, all the pieces were in place. I had secure documentation of my professional capabilities, a confirmed external opportunity that would advance my career beyond anything possible at Meridian, intelligence indicating that my clients would support a transition to a new firm, and most importantly, the psychological clarity to act decisively when the moment arrived. The moment arrived sooner than I expected, and it came in exactly the form that Roger and Linda had planned from the beginning. But what they didn't realize was that I was no longer the same person they had been scheming against for months. I was no longer dependent on their approval, vulnerable to their manipulation, or constrained by their institutional limitations. Was ready for war, and I was going to win it on my own terms. If you've ever felt undervalued at work or watched others take credit for your achievements, you know how Sarah felt in that moment. But here's what makes this story different. Sarah didn't just survive the betrayal, she turned it into the foundation for something bigger. The military taught her that sometimes the strongest position isn't defending where you are, but advancing to where your enemies can't follow. What happened next changed everything, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who thought they could manipulate her loyalty against her own interests. If you want to see how this story ends and learn exactly how Sarah made her boss beg for forgiveness, make sure you're subscribed because the conclusion will show you that sometimes the best revenge is simply being irreplaceable in all the right ways. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this plays out. Drop a comment if you've ever been in a similar situation, and let me know. What would you have done differently? Your story might, be featured in our next video.